So, brief recap on this: active listening, a skill we can use. We really are focused on three components to this skill. How do we listen? What quality of listening do we bring? What quality of attention do we bring? Two, what kind of questions can we use to actually open up this experience for the young person? And three, how can we paraphrase and ideally make sure that we're able to connect with the emotional content in our paraphrasing or simply in the engagement as a whole? So that's the active listening skill, and we're going to drill this skill in your tutorial sessions. But it's just the first part of the guidance role. The second part of the guidance role is really where we move into mentoring, where we sort of open up the mentoring and the unique features of mentoring. And so here we're going to talk about what is the value of sharing or of introducing what is called intersubjective experience. Intersubjectivity being the interchange of thoughts and feelings between two subjectivities, between two persons. To see the master here, I have to take you to mother-infant dyads. So before agency is developed at all, in fact, before some notion of self is developed at all, infants are very tightly coupled in their emotional expressions, their feeling states and their emotions, with an interacting partner. So we call these kinds of interactions dyadic interactions. Any of you with children will be familiar with what this looks like. So you get at around the 3-month stage, this sudden turn taking, which feels like conversation. In fact, it's often called proto-conversation, intersubjectivity, between the infant and a caregiver, where there's this sort of reciprocity, where there's a toning. So it's a cooing and a carring and a cooing and an ahhing that's done in a kind of interchange and turn taking that picks up on the young person's tone, carries it forward, brings it back, the young person picks it up, and it really feels like you are in an intersubjective state. In other words, the thoughts and feelings are moving back and forth. In fact, one would argue that actual subjectivity comes after intersubjectivity for infants. So they start with an intersubjectivity and then gradually over time realize that their subjectivity is actually distinct from the world outside them. In fact, it takes up to about 4 years before children are able to pass what's called the false belief test, which is basically an exercise which shows that they understand that other people can hold points of view on the world different from the point of view that they in fact hold on the world. Before that age, young people actually are not able to disambiguate the way they see the world from the way the world is being seen by others. And one would argue that extends, sadly, all the way through adolescence and into adulthood, where a preoccupation with self or one's own points of view, there is an awareness of other points of view, but that over-preoccupation becomes a challenge. And one thing we want to do is be able to introduce intersubjectivity again. So return to these sort of infant roots. This is actually work that's true to my heart. I did my PhD work on mother-infant interaction, and particularly what happens to intersubjectivity and the way that affects cognition and language, where it is intersected by micronutrient deficiency. So in particular, iron deficiency, anemia. Cliff note, it's bad. Nutrition turns out to be really, really important for human interaction, infant caregiver interaction, but also for a bunch of developmental outcomes that we might care about. We go from dyadic to triadic. Or triadic is an awareness of the other, but a joint attention with the other on external objects. So typically you see this at around 8 or 9 months. It's actually the age that I did most of my work with. And so you see at this age, the subjectivity now is not just a back and forth between the partners. The subjectivity now is a kind of triangle. It's an awareness of what the other's awareness and the world. So it's this sort of triangle that goes on, or joint attention that goes on. And again, there are different strategies here for how to work with intersubjectivity that are more or less effective. So for example, it's more effective to follow into an infant's attention on an object, for example, and then name that object, versus trying to push their attention to an object over here and kind of squeaking and saying, hey, what is this object over here? Look, 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 block. Rather, follow into the attention and then name the object, right? That's one way of building in language learning, using this triadic or joint attention, right? Okay, so that's the masters in this space, is moms and infants, and you can, go and find some moms and infants or be one yourself to get a sense of what's really going on with this sort of intersubjective exchange. How do we introduce intersubjectivity much later on? Again, we're interested in the interchange of thoughts and feelings between persons where there is a mutual recognition of each other as, on the one hand, unique. So there's a unique subjectivity over there, but there's also an equality. There's a commonness of human experience. And we find that where this is lacking, there's this really telling concept called totalization tends to occur. So totalization, I actually alluded to very early on in this series by talking about what happens when we reduce somebody's identity down to one or two characteristics. We totalize them. They become totally encompassed by this one or two characteristics. And you can think of how this happens with different racial groups, with different nationalities, with different football teams, with different in-groups and out-groups, thanks to the fundamentally social nature of humanity. The problem is, of course, it's deeply problematic. When we totalize someone, we dehumanize them. We take away a shared recognition of our equal humanity, and there is risk in that. There's not just risk in terms of closing off potential for basic humanitarian action. There's also risk in what it does to us. Because what it does to us is it reduces our encounter with diversity in a way that allows our point of view or perspective to increasingly become more and more brittle. So we're not encountering and negotiating and engaging with diversity in both its uniqueness and its equality, its commonality. And as a consequence, we become more and more brittle, and our worldview becomes narrower and narrower. So we're interested in a broader perspective, a broader view, and we know we can get that by bringing about more interchanges that have this quality of intersubjectivity. So how do we do that? Well, one powerful way of doing that humanity has been doing since humanity's been doing is storytelling. Really great work here by the historian Yuval Harari. He wrote a book called Sapiens, a very popular book. There's a couple of follow-ups to that too, Homo Deus, another book on the basic global challenges. But one central hypothesis of his storytelling is that it is our storytelling capacity as a species that allows us to actually accomplish these massive projects across more than a small social group. So if we're going to coordinate projects across hundreds to thousands to hundreds and thousands of people, we need to have shared fictions that we can all buy into so that we can become part of that story, that shared story. So an example there would be a concept like money. Money is a kind of fiction. It's a story that we can get behind. Brands would be other examples. Okay, so what's at play here? What's at play is that stories are very powerful in organizing our identity narratives, the stories of who we are and how we make sense of the world, and therefore impact dramatically on the lens, the perspective, or the point of view that we have. So what we're interested in doing is how can we use our own storytelling to allow us to share point of view or perspective, or to introduce point of view and perspective in this intersubjective manner. We know that storytelling is immensely engaging, and that's another feature that we have of this inbuilt capacity of being a storytelling species, is that we are immediately engaged by narratives. Marketers have been doing this forever. If you want people to connect with something, you don't simply give them a bunch of facts, you build in a story, because humans are very sensitive to looking at narrative, and we'll start to look at narrative structure that turns out to be most engaging in a second. We're also very good, in fact, we're naturally, innately good at noticing differences in emphasis in stories. We notice what's included, we notice what's left out, we notice what's foregrounded, what's reacted to, what is not. All of those capacities are not learnt, they come sort of built in. And this is why, soap operas and, fiction that is otherwise, one might assume quite hammy on the outside, but actually very easy to become engaged in because we're very good at tracking characters and looking at what they're paying attention to, what they're not, what they're leaving out, how they're reacting, how they're not reacting. Humor works often by counterposing or sort of surprising what the reactions might be, or what the assumptions might be. And so we're very good at this. These are natural capacities that we have, and we pay a lot of attention to stories. This is something we see also in our work with our work groups that we run with you guys. Again, we'll get to this when we talk about transition content. But if I ask a mentor to tell me a story of their first job interview, and what they do is they tell that story in very abstract terms, you'll see the attention of everyone in the room just sort of disappear. But if I get them to actually build in a lot of rich detail, so it is actually a story about them, you'll see suddenly the attention focus. So the difference between people who sort of go to advice or go to abstraction versus those who use a narrative is profound in terms of the way it engages attention, especially for young people. The other thing to notice about storytelling is that in order for someone to shift perspective, they've got to reach in and find a point of view that allows them to do the work of shifting. Great art is great because it doesn't hit you over the head with what it wants you to think. What it does instead is invite you into the conversation, which allows you to develop out your point of view, to look at the world in a slightly different way. Right? That's what we want to do with stories. We don't want to tell stories like very simple parables where we say, so this is therefore what it is that you should be doing. It's going to be far less engaging. Whereas if we can tell a story that invites the person in and allows them to react to, even if they're reacting to is just an awareness of what their perspective is not, that's helpful from a guidance point of view. Remember, this is falling within this concept of guidance and building out perspective. Okay, so what is the skill here? Some things to notice about stories and what counts as great stories. I can't really go into tremendous detail here because to do that I'd have to bring in all of the great writers of the world, all of the great directors of the world, all of the great artists really, all of the great storytellers to actually really pick out some masterful examples. But what I can do is show you some of the key components of what counts as a good story. So the first thing is that really good stories seem to build expectation. So remember that prediction engine I was talking about earlier, this prefrontal cortex that's constantly modeling an outcome, a path, and a duration, constantly predicting what could happen, and then calculating whether what happened was better than or worse than expected. That's actually the dopamine signal. That's the chase signal that then comes aboard based on whether something was better or worse than predicted. So that surprise, right, turns out to be very engaging. Sadly, social media companies have discovered this, and almost everything they're doing with their algorithms is around building just enough of a surprise or a novelty to keep that dopamine pumped, to keep that chasing going on. From our point of view, we want to make sure that our stories don't sort of start and end in the first sentence. We want them to build expectation. To do that, we want to signal that change is imminent, but it's not there yet. So there's something around pay attention now. We also want to make sure that we generate empathy in our stories. So there has to be some connection with the characters that are involved. And to do that, we have to evoke some sort of emotional investment, right? Now, usually we can do that by referencing some norm or norm violation or challenge, right? So often you'll hear this. In fact, I was just sitting at a breakfast meeting and I overheard on a table next to me somebody sharing a story about dog walking. And immediately the way they brought the person's attention in, and the way the person's attention just initially sailed in any case, was to look at what they considered to be a norm violation, what was or wasn't okay, right? That generated emotional investment, which generated interest in the conversation. It's a hard cocktail problem that I have. I tend to be able to very easily pick up on other conversations. Very difficult to focus in more than one. But in any case, another fascinating example of how it is that people use emotional investment simply by referencing some norm or some norm violation or some norm challenge, or something that someone did that was against the way things should be according to their framing, immediately gets a kind of investment. The next thing that stories do, great stories that is, that pull out these different components, is they reveal direction or purposeful action. So they've got a path and a duration. There's something about the actors and the quality of the actors that isn't sort of random. There's a sort of a purposeness to it, right? A direction to it. It's got a approach and it's got a time scale. There's interesting counterexamples to this, that stories that play with duration. So, stories that start in the middle and then take you back. Pulp Fiction's a great example of that. Many different examples in this space, but they are playing with path, approach, duration, and of course with this third component, which is the outcome. And the way stories do this is they normally have a path, duration, and then a resolve. So there's something that gets conquered or failed to conquer, whether that's some aspect of the internal character, so the internal character's growth, or some aspect of the internal character in the external world, so, resolving the hostage situation, or, winning the football match, or whatever it is that you like in terms of your storytelling. But there's some resolve. And that resolve, by the way, is, of course, the outcome against the actions that are stated in this, revealing the directed, the purposeful actions. So those are some of the components. There is one more. And this one really is whether you have the gift of humor. If you have the gift of humor, adding humor to your storytelling is very, very powerful. Okay, so how do you build storytelling into your guidance approach? Remember, you're starting with active listening, lots of active listening. And then there's a question of, at what point is it worth bringing in this quality of intersubjectivity? So allowing this person to encounter a perspective or a point of view in your story, again, without you sort of hammering that point of view or perspective. Well, the first thing is thinking about which stories to tell and when. And we're going to do work on this in our tutorial session. The first thing to notice, of course, is we have to get permission. Again, remember the wait mnemonic. Why am I talking, right? Get permission. Don't jump in with your story because you think your story can one up. You'll see some red flags in a second, right? Or don't jump in with your story because you want them to know you've had something that happened just like them, right? That's not how we're using storytelling here. So the first thing we want to do is get permission. Do you mind if I share my perspective? Right? Do you mind if I tell you something, that evoked something in me? Do you mind if I share with you a story from my own life, right? Getting permission up front is going to be really crucial to doing this. Then we want to tell stories that have what we call thematically relevant narratives. So what are those? These are not identical overlaps with the content of the person's story. Rather, they are looking for some sense of the positioning, the perspective, the point of view that is overlapping. And this is really where common human experience comes into play. So again, I'm going to give you an extreme example just to help you position this. But imagine someone who has been through something horrendous like sexual abuse. You don't need to have been through sexual abuse yourself to know what it's like to feel vulnerable or afraid, or to know what it's like to need additional support or help, or how to reach out for help. Notice how there is immediately aspects of the common human experience that we can build across different subjectivities because we are one species, right? Because we are this sort of shared humanity. So we're interested in thematically relevant narratives. Now, again, I use that example to give you an extreme. I'm not suggesting that as someone who discloses sexual abuse, the first thing you do is jump into a story. We'll talk about how to handle cause for concerns. We'll talk about that additional support that's required if certain content comes up in conversations. That's all part of our safeguarding section that we'll get to. Rather, what I'm saying is, if you just listen to someone telling you a story about, let's say, leaving home or starting a job or break up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, if you listen to that, you're going to find that if you're listening carefully and you're doing your active listening and you're doing your paraphrasing, you're going to start to get a sense of some themes. It's going to evoke for you some examples from your own life where there is some sort of overlapping theme. And you don't have to do the job of making the connection to that overlapping theme. Again, think of what a good film or a book actually does. It simply presents to you a point of view in the world, and your reaction to it can change over time. If you read a book once when you're 18 and again when you're 25 and then again when you're in your 30s and 40s, you'll find that what you'll get from that point of view or perspective will differ depending on where you are now and your current positioning. And we're doing the same with a story. We don't know what the person is going to take for the story. They're going to reach in and find something that's of value to them. All we're looking for is where is some overlap that can spark off some narrative that we think might be relevant in this context. In this sense, again, we've mentioned what are the qualities of great stories. They build expectation, they generate empathy, they're purposeful, they've got a resolve, and if they can add humor. Some simple ways of doing this: the language of experience, in my experience, or the language of information, what I have learned. But we really don't want to go at it in that sort of clunky fashion. We really want to have practiced. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to look at the range of domains that we work with in transition planning. So emotional health, social health, cognitive health, identity health, community and citizenship, home and family, sport and recreation, work and money. All these different domains we're going to go through. And we're going to think about these. What stories are applicable for us in the context of social health? Maybe it's a story of a conflict with a really good friend. Maybe it's a story of feeling lonely. Maybe we're going to look through each of these things and find out where are some areas where we have matured or grown in our point of view. And then we're going to practice how we would actually tell that story without, again, hitting anyone on the head with what our point of view is, right? That requires practice. Trust me on this one. Even when I'm doing sessions like this, I always think to myself, I'll think up examples as I go through. But if you don't think up an example in advance and you try and come up with one on the spot, you will almost always fall short. Okay, another point here, I just made the same point. Don't rush the connections. You've got to let the mentee find the point of view. You're not requiring them to become your point of view. So that point really belongs over here on the red flags. So what are the red flags here? Don't try and one up with your story. Don't think your story has to be about an identical event. Active listening first, lots of it. Make sure you've processed the events of your story. You're not unloading. And we'll talk in our practice session, in our tutorial session, about how we ensure that we're not sort of unloading on the young person about something that happened to us in that day. The reality is, unless you can tell what we call an integrated narrative, so a narrative that's able to connect your past, your present, and your future, you have not processed an event. So if I'm interviewing someone for a job, for example, and I ask them why they left their previous employer, and there's a whole range of stories and they can't quite figure out that story, I know that they haven't quite resolved that challenge yet. You see the same thing with people talking about breakups and past relationships. But if they're able to tell that past, link it to where they are now, and connect it to where they're going, now we've got an integrated narrative. One would argue, in fact many do, that the entire process of therapy is about creating what are called durable narratives. So narratives that do allow you to connect aspects of your past, your present, and your future. So to do that as in a comprehensive manner as possible. And that's indeed the process of building out a narrative, building out an identity that is more adaptive, more resilient, right? So here we're going to make sure that when we tell stories, we're telling stories that have this integrated component, and we're not one-upping. We're not going, hey, you should, that happened to you. You should see what happened to me. And we don't have to have identical events. We don't have to tell stories that just on the nose. Okay, well, let me tell you about an argument I also had with my boss. Not helpful. And then mostly we're going to do active listening first. In fact, I would say 80% of mentoring is the first stage of this. It's active listening. There's a big part of this that's also in the support role, but 80% of this comes down to being able to do active listening well. Yes, this storytelling tends to come a little bit later in the process, and there is Socratic questioning or challenging. We're going to get to that right now. The third aspect of guidance is challenging. We sometimes refer to this as Socratic questioning. Some of you might be familiar with the story of Socrates, ancient Greek philosopher. Socrates, in fact, was put to death by the ancient Greeks. Why was he put to death? He was put to death for corrupting the youth. How was he corrupting the youth? Well, he was using a style of questioning which basically encouraged people, interrogated people really, to constantly challenge their assumptions. So the idea would be, give me an answer to that argument. Okay, let me challenge the assumption of that argument, and then keep on going all the way down. Of course, this turns out to be a slightly dangerous thing to do at the dawn of democracy. Nevertheless, this idea of Socratic questioning is one that has translated into the broader picture of how does challenging work? Right? How do we actually challenge directly, confront directly a set of assumptions, whether that be feeling states, beliefs, knowledge, habits, or conditions? I'm going to talk about those in a second, in a way that is productive, meaningful, and sensitive. So our model for doing this is to draw on multidisciplinary science. So we're not just drawing on one literature to get this done. And in this section, as part of guidance, I'm really going to only give you one tool that's available to you under the sort of broad banner of challenging. But really, any of the interventions that may become of use to you and your mentee as you move through the year and pick transition projects you'd like to work on really fall under the scope of challenging. Right? That is how they're effectively framed for us. So let's look at the levers that are available to us by looking at the broader scientific landscape here. And again, I'm doing this very briefly because this content is coming when we look at transition content. So the first is feelings, and really here we have available to us the whole field of cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, particularly translational neuroscience. Leading figure in the field there, more academic, would be Antonio Damasio. Leading public figure in the field would be Andrew Huberman. If you look at the Huberman Lab podcast, you'll see a lot of interventions. So interventions designed as levers for affecting positive outcomes in behavior and perspective. They don't quite use that language, but for affecting positive outcomes using what is known to us about cognitive and behavioral neuroscience. Translational neuroscience is a fascination for me. I spent a lot of time doing fMRI studies of addiction, looking at behavioral addictions. So I have for some time been thinking about how we can take what we know in the neuroscience, in particular the cognitive neuroscience literature, and what's called the neuroeconomic literature, and applying that to intervention science to allow for more positive outcomes in perspective and behavior change. So there we're going to target feeling states. Next, we can talk about beliefs. And here, the real sort of guru in this area would be your founder of cognitive behavioral therapy. That would be Aaron Beck. And there are some great popular books that are available to you to think about how you can use basic strategies from cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most empirically tested and supported of approaches for challenging these normative assumptions, these propositions about the way we ought to be or ought not to be. That's the work we're going to do in a second. We're going to look at one strategy for engaging with limiting or contracting beliefs. From a knowledge point of view, as a lever, so introducing knowledge at different levels. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail later. This is really the science of, philosophy really, of epistemology, so the study of how we know what we know. But interestingly, the leading figure here doesn't happen to be a philosopher. It's a physicist, a guy named David Deutsch. Some really terrific work in that space being put together by David Deutsch on what counts as good explanations for the world in which we live in. There, the discussion often gets to counterfactual thinking, and I alluded to that earlier. Habits. This one has been going for some time. I'm going to point you to BJ Fogg. He has a rather unfortunate name, but he is from the Stanford Behavioral Design Lab, and really that's the whole field of behavioral psychology. More contemporary versions of this, or more popular versions of this, would be Atomic Habits. The name is eluding me right now, but effectively Atomic Habits is built off the back of BJ Fogg's book, which is called Tiny Habits. Sadly, BJ Fogg did no marketing research. He's a standard academic. Then we look at conditions, and this is really the whole science of behavioral economics, and you can go there to Danny Kahneman, the only psychologist to ever win a Nobel Prize. He didn't win it in psychology because there is no Nobel Prize for psychology. He won it in economics and revised the field of economics to look at how it is that certain framing, certain environmental contingencies can shape or change behavior. Okay, so those are the different levers that are available to us that we can translate into different kinds of intervention or different ways of challenging some of the precursors to behavior and perspective change. Let's look at one example of this, one tool that we can use in this space. And it's called Socratic questioning. That's our term. Another term here would be incisive questioning. And that really draws on some of the work that Nancy Kline has done, although there are some additional revisions that we've built into this particular approach. We've been using this approach of challenging assumptions for some time in our work here at Say Yes. So the first thing is to obtain permission. So we're not trying to get someone unstuck from a situation unless we've got to the point where someone is going, okay, I'm sort of stuck here, right? I'd like to actually try and figure this out. I'd like to try and work through this. So would you like to try an approach to getting unstuck here? Or let's walk through the different stages of an exercise called Socratic questioning. So notice we're not doing any magic tricks. We're not showing up and using techniques without the young person being aware of them. In fact, everything I've described to you is described to young people, slightly different detail, but we talk about active listening, we talk about perspective sharing or storytelling, and we talk about Socratic questioning or challenging. So this becomes a tool that you and your mentee contract to use. But you may not use this tool. You may use other tools that also are designed to pick out particular targets. Normally, when we design an intervention for a particular match, what we're doing is we're looking at all of the levers and how we can encompass an approach which targets not just the feelings or the beliefs, but also looks at habits, also looks at conditions, also looks at knowledge. But okay, let's get permission, first of all, to use this basic tool. And broadly, this is really agenda setting, clarifying and contracting. First thing you've got to do is you've got to identify what the goal is. What's the intention or what's the aspiration? Now, notice the mistake right out the gate. People often do this and they accuse it as a particularly gendered approach. You know, someone will come and they'll unload on you a bunch of challenges and the person immediately turns that into okay, here's a problem, let's try and solve it. And then they get pushed back. I'm not trying to solve the problem. I don't want a problem. I just want to be heard. You all would have had some experience with that sort of interaction. Well, what's going on there is the person may not have a goal or an intention or an aspiration. So don't assume that, right? You're only doing this exercise if there is something very clear that the person is saying they would like to get done, or there's a thing that they want to work on that they are just stuck on, that they find themselves saying they want to do this thing time and time again. They want to exercise more, or they want to sleep better, or they want to be more efficient in the way they handle their email, or whatever it is that they want to do. And they're saying this is something they really want to do, and they seem to be stuck. They seem to be unable to actually move forward. And so this exercise is an exercise in unlocking that sort of stuckness, right? Okay, so what do you think you might want to change here? And you're working with the person to get that clear in their own words. I want to. So just use sentence stems, so the beginning of a sentence, for the person to complete the rest of the sentence. And you're getting that as clear as possible. You should be mindful right at this stage, we'll go into this when we do some tutorials on this, but you should be mindful of the level of abstraction in the phrasing. An aspiration or a goal or an objective or a next step. What are you actually getting at? Are you getting at, I want to be someone who makes an impact in the world? Far more aspirational. Are you getting at more of a goal, right? I'd like to have achieved this by this particular date. We'll talk about SMART goals and we talk about transition planning. Or are you really just talking about an objective? I want to make sure that I phone X about my ID. If you get the level of detail wrong here, it's going to be very hard for you to do this exercise. And it's going to depend on how they are stuck. So we're going to have to revise this as we go forward. But effectively, just be cautious be aware or be mindful of the level of abstraction in the challenge that you're describing. And I would say, on average, although not always the case, you're looking for something intermediate. So something between an aspiration and a next step. Okay. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to look for the contraction. So the thing that is contracting or drawing in the subjective experience, the behavior, and therefore allowing this person not to move forward, so keeping them stuck. Now this exercise, there's a very simple way of doing it. In fact, it's just to go to that last question that you see at the bottom there, which is what are you ultimately not prepared to feel? So what's the way you don't want to feel here? But there's really quite a lot of detail towards getting to that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is core limiting assumptions. Notice that this is drawing on CBT literature, cognitive behavioral therapy literature, right? Okay, so what's a core limiting assumption? Something that is fundamentally making it harder for you to move forward. Now, you might get a response like, okay, I need to get my driving license. Okay, what's the core limiting assumption? Well, I don't have the money for doing my learner's test. Now, that's not a core limiting assumption, right? That's simply something that is on the way towards getting at a core limiting assumption, right? There's something more that sits behind that that's going to be stopping, right? Otherwise, the person would simply have done the thing that needs to be done to get the thing done, and we wouldn't really be talking about being stuck here, right? So how do we get at what this contraction will do? Well, one way of doing it is just what else. So what do you think you might be assuming that is making it harder? What do you think is most stopping you from moving forward? So you're looking for the contraction, the over-identification with an assumption that is then resisting forward movement. So when you think of what's happening is somebody's whole identity is being collapsed down to a single assumption about the way the world is or about the way they are that is making it hard for them to move forward. That's really getting at what a core limiting assumption is. Now, there's different ways of organizing what these are. Again, this is classic CBT literature. So, for example, often your core limiting assumptions, contractions, or over-identifications have to do with autonomy. So you'll get people having a sense of, well, what I don't want to feel, again, remember that sort of ultimate question, is I don't want to feel incompetent or useless, right? Or I really need to feel competent or important, right? So or efficient or effective. So there's something about autonomy and the efficacy, the productivity. But often what you get is actually more sociotropic type contractions. So these are more about the sense of social value. So I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable enough, I'm not worthy, right? Each one of those you see tends to connect in to some social evaluation. Another way of looking at both of these is to look for classic CBT. Are you framing a situation or an assumption as permanent and pervasive? So permanent, this thing doesn't change, and pervasive, so this occurs across all context. So I'm late for a meeting, right? Now, is the person going, I'm always late? That now becomes a pervasive contraction. And permanent, there's nothing I can do, it's just who I am. I'm a late person, permanent, right? Versus temporary or specific. So on today's occasion, for today's meeting, I was late. That is temporary, it gives a for today, and specific for this particular meeting. That kind of framing around assumptions tends to be less contracting, whereas the permanent and pervasive tends to be more contracting. So you can work with people on figuring out, are you looking at something that's more permanent and pervasive, or are you looking at something that's more temporary and specific? We've got additional tools that actually work just on this particular area, looking in particular at a concept called growth mindset. Also, you may just find that there's some factual assumptions, but almost always these are never the contraction. Sometimes in CBT, you'll get people working in this space. So someone saying something like, I'm afraid of flying because, my chances of dying are just so high. And then you go, well, let's actually look at the statistics, the number of times you're in a car, the number of times you're in a plane, the number of deaths that occur due to plane crashes, the number that occur due to cars, and you sort of work through the reasoning and you go, okay, well, there's actually a factual statement that you're holding that's false here, right? But almost never that's the contraction. So an example of this would be, I don't have money to go and get my driver's license. That would be the factual statement. Almost never will that be the contraction that's really frustrating somebody moving forward. Again, we're not talking about situations that are difficult to get done. There might be many examples like, hey, I can't get that done because I don't have that. Okay, we're not talking about that. We're talking about something that you would really like to do, that is really valuable and important to you, that is otherwise easily available to you, but that for some reason you seem to be tripping yourself up. That's when we use challenging. That's when we use this idea of Socratic questioning. Okay, So as I say, you are normally looking for a normative proposition, and that's the key. When you're looking for an assumption, it's normally a value judgment that's being held as if it's a factual statement. And often in psychology, we'll talk about a functional dysfunction. So a belief that is dysfunctional on the surface because it's stopping you moving forward, but it's functional in that it's doing some work in terms of your internal psychology. The work that it's typically doing, by the way, is preventing you from having the experience of feeling a certain way. And again, we'll get into this when we do a tutorial example of this. But some examples there would be a perfection or an outcome-based worth assumption. So like, I'm only valuable if I have achieved something externally in the outside world. Another would be a justice for me. So, this world is just fundamentally unfair, and why isn't this world more fair for me? Another would be effortless perfection. So the assumption that really to do something really, really well, it shouldn't feel hard. It should be absolutely effortless. These are examples of functional dysfunctions that often play out in the normative propositions, right? Again, this all might sound a little complicated right now. Effectively, all you're doing is you're working with someone to say, what are you aiming for? And then you're saying, what's stopping you moving towards this? And you're starting to get a list of things that are stopping them moving towards this. And you're looking for the thing that looks less like a factual statement and more like a normative proposition, so more like a value judgment. And then what we're going to do is we're going to flip that around. So the next step here is reframing or unlocking. So we'd say, well, okay, let's assume that the assumption here, I'll give you an example of the driving example. So the driving example is, I don't want to be reckless, right? I don't want to be somehow reckless and therefore harm someone else. That's an actual example of somebody discovering what their contracting assumption was that was stopping them moving forward and getting this driving license. Right? Well, what's the direct opposite of that? Now, important here, I could say, well, the opposite of reckless to me is responsible. But that's not helpful. What I want is this person to give me the opposite of that assumption in their own words. So you want the framing from their side. Now, notice if all you've got to here is a factual statement. So you've gone through these assumptions and you've got to I don't want to drive because, I can't afford I haven't got the money together to pay for the learner's test. And then you're going to say to them, okay, what's the direct opposite of that, which is I do have the money to pay for that learner's test. You'll be actually asking them to try on a false statement, and that's not going to be helpful. You're going to get stuck at that point, right? So you've got to find that contraction in terms of typically a value judgment, right? Now you flip it around. So what's the direct opposite of that? Someone who's this. Okay, well, let's reframe that assumption with its direct opposite. So here it's almost like trying on a hypothesis or trying on a suit or something to that effect, right? If you knew, and then you use the liberating assumptions, if you knew that you were a deeply socially conscious person, how would you go about obtaining your driver's license, right? And there you now ask that question and you get a bunch of answers, and then you answer it again. What's happening is, as soon as the person tries on the liberating assumption, they suddenly get an unlocking. So the contraction unlocks, and suddenly all this list of easy possibilities for what they could do next to actually work towards this goal start to percolate. I've done this exercise with people who've been stuck on finishing an MBA, and they've wrote to me sort of 3-4 months later, said, this literally, I was stuck on this for 2 years. The MBA is done. So you can do this in so many. It's such a powerful exercise if done well and if done with the person's consent, cooperation, and investment. Again, none of these things are going to be used as sort of tools or tricks on someone without them actually saying, hey, I'd like to try that tool. Hey, I'd like to use that particular technique and see how that works for me. So you keep asking the question with permission to unlock possibilities for forward action. And then it's really important to appreciate the work or the process. Okay, that's one example of how we do challenging using Socratic questioning. What are some red flags here? Relationship first, active listening first, assumption checking or incisive questioning or Socratic questioning should always be framed non-judgmentally, so with kindness. As you go through the whole process, really important not to come at this with any judgment, so making the person feel small or little for the thing that they're stuck on. And this, again, it sort of surprises me how little people are aware of the extent to which they hold these contracting assumptions, or how easily we assume that certain individuals, because they are accomplished and show up in various ways, how they wouldn't have any of these contracting assumptions. And actually, when you do the work and you actually start looking at these things, you find people that are otherwise very impressive in all these different areas, holding beliefs like, I cannot make a mistake. Like if I make a mistake, the way I'm not prepared to feel is incompetent. And as a result of that, I've been an incredible accountant my whole life. And so there's the functional dysfunction. It's great. But the question is going to be, are they an incredible accountant because they are deliberately choosing to be an incredible accountant? Or is that happening because they couldn't be otherwise, because the belief is happening through them because of the contraction rather than them making the choice? And you'll see in a lot of our work here, when we talk about working with perspective, what we're trying to do is introduce more degrees of freedom in someone's point of view. So lifting the point of view out so that it feels more volitional, more deliberate, more informed, more of a choice rather than something that's happening to you. And finally, as I said on the red flag side, always helpful to appreciate the process, because when you unlock someone's limiting belief, you remember you are moving that functional dysfunction, removing it, and therefore that person can suddenly step into the feeling they didn't want to feel, and that can be very scary and can have consequences. So we have to be careful how we work in this space. And again, anything we do at Say Yes on the challenging or the intervention side is really coming through our transition support teams.